right now.
Hear you.
And if you're a CASA of Lexington volunteer, you don't need to do anything else except be here for tonight for the training. In order to receive your CEU credits, I'll log them, log everyone's attendance, and it'll be updated in your file probably by next week. If you're a member of the public joining us, we're glad to have you. And if you need documentation that you completed this training, please email me at info@casaoflexington.org. Our training tonight is led by Jenny Jones. She's a faculty member at Bluegrass Community Technical College, where she currently serves as an assistant dean. She earned a Ph.D. from Capella University, and she teaches in the psychology and human services departments. In December 2020, she completed CASA volunteer training in Madison County. And Jenny, I'll let you take it from here.
All right, thank you. Welcome you all. So much like you all, I wanted to get involved with CASA to be a voice for children. And I have a background in mental health counseling, but also a background in accounting. And so people ask me all the time how an accountant became a psychologist. And I think this is a pretty good presentation to explain that, because I think life kind of happens sometimes. And I found out through life that there were things that were more important to me and more dear to my heart than balance sheets and income statements. So I switched over and went the accounting route and ended up getting my PhD in psychology. And so one of the things that when I was working on my doctorate, I did my dissertation on the spiritual experience of losing a parent to suicide. And that's because there is very little research on adults who lose a parent to suicide. And so I went on that journey and completed that dissertation, and really found out some very valuable lessons during that. And while I was working on my dissertation, near the end of it actually, my question in my mind, which probably always will be in my mind, is why do people die by suicide? My mother died by suicide. It's been 23 years and 2 days. So we just went through that anniversary. And so, you know, I've always asked myself that question for all of these years. My grandmother, I never met her. She also died by suicide. And so I was asking the question, you know, why do people die by suicide? And I came across the ACEs study. And that ACEs study has probably came closer to answering my question than anything ever will. So while I don't have the answer to my question, I at least understand how adverse childhood experiences can affect people across the lifespan. And we'll talk more about that, but I kind of wanted to introduce that to start off with, because how this presentation starts off is I have 10 questions to ask you all. And you all just, you can keep count in your head. You can get out a scratch piece of paper. These aren't questions for you to answer to the group. These are just questions for you to answer to yourself. And so they're very personal questions. They are the questions from the original ACEs study. So what I'm going to be referring to is something called an ACE score. Out of these 10 questions, every time you answer yes, that will be 1 point. So if you answer yes on 5 questions, you would have an ACE score of 5 and so forth. So before I display the questions, I do want to say this. On the last slide is my contact information. And if any of what we talk about brings up something in you that you want to talk about even a day or two from now, and you just just want to say it out loud to somebody, feel free to do that with me. I'm your colleague. I don't know. Let me put it to y'all this way. You all know a lot more about CASA children than I do. I don't have one yet. So I'm going to be getting my first. So I welcome conversation, comments. We can stop and kind of unpack as we go, or we can save that for later. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share the questions. Let's see. I believe that I could make those a little bigger for you all. Let me see if I can. Does that help?
That's good. We can see.
Okay. So the questions say, please answer the question with either yes or no. And I'm asking, before you turned 18, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you? So I'll be quiet and I'll give you all a few minutes and then I'll scroll down. Are you ready for me to scroll down? Okay, have I given you all sufficient time? Since everybody's muted, if you want me to put the questions back up for another minute, just raise your hand. Okay. All right. Okay, hang on a second. My screen share is not wanting to share. There we go. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences across the lifespan. But here's what we're really talking about. I think we're probably all familiar with stress. The question is what do the different kinds of stress do to you? So I will say that a positive stress may give you a brief increase in heart rate, make you a little happy, kind of elevate your stress hormones just a little bit, but not too much. And to where with positive stress, you kind of feel a little bit of that excitement. And it may be getting ready to go out for the evening, a little bit of stress getting ready, but it's all positive. It's going to have a good ending. Tolerable stress. Well, I have to admit, I guess it's tolerable stress tonight. I get very nervous when I have to present, but hopefully that's tolerable. A lot of people have that. Sometimes when we have stress, things coming at us or things happening to us, as long as we feel as if we have some control over those things, then our stress remains more on the tolerable end of the scale. But toxic stress, prolonged activation of that stress response, that fight, flight, or freeze response. And as we have prolonged activation of that response, it changes our neurons, it changes the chemicals in our brain, and it eventually changes the structure and the function of your brain over time. And we'll look in just a few minutes at the brain and kind of how that happens. But, you know, stress is one of those things that we have to live with. We can't really eliminate it completely. So we have to learn to live with it. Hopefully, we learn to live with stress that's down in the positive or tolerable areas most of the time. So this is that stress brain loop. In the stress brain loop, you know, that, and you can kind of imagine when you get stressed, how you feel this loop kind of rolling through. You get stressed and you can't sleep well. And, you know, poor nutrition might not be the lack of eating. It might be eating junk foods, or maybe eating too much food, or not eating enough food. And then you kind of get that emotional distress. Well, that increases something called glucocorticoids. That is a hormone that normally bathes your brain under a good stress. But as that chronic stress increases, there's more and more and more of those glucocorticoids that start to almost become toxic in your brain. And so that causes those cellular changes, the cellular changes in your hippocampus, your old brain, where we, where our breathing and respiration comes from. And so as the glucocorticoids increase, then we can no longer regulate our cortisol like we should. And so we end up either becoming chronically stressed and losing quite a bit of weight, or usually the opposite, as we become stressed and have inadequate sleep and poor nutrition, we often end up gaining weight under stress. And then, of course, in that stress brain loop of chronic stress, it affects your attention. So people start talking to you and you can't remember exactly what you were saying or what they were saying. Your perception, the way you see things, short-term memory, learning, how you learn, or a big one really is word finding. Now, many people know what they want to say, but then under stress, they lose words. And so some people lose words and they'll kind of stop for a second, and sometimes they'll just blow it off and move on, or sometimes they'll lose words and it's very stressful for them to be able to think of where they were in that conversation and move on. So as we're talking about the stress hormones and our neurons firing, so these green arrows, if our brain is unstressed, those neurons fire in just a straight direct motion across a continuum. There's tight control of those different thoughts and emotions and what you're seeing and what you're feeling and your actions. So you have tight control. Your prefrontal cortex, that's where a lot of your executive decisions are made. And so, one of the things that children experience is their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. So they don't necessarily make good decisions, or they don't make executive decisions. And so unstressed, your brain functions like it should. But as those stress hormones come in and start to kind of toxify your brain, your prefrontal cortex does not get the flow through traffic or the messages like it should. Your amygdala is where your fear center is. And so when your neurons are firing and you don't have good control over your thoughts and emotions, then you also probably are not going to be making good decisions. And so the stressed brain ends up under this kind of toxic pressure. So does anybody know what happens to a lump of coal if you put that lump of coal under pressure for a long period of time?
Shadows.
Pardon?
Shadows?
Shadows, okay.
No, shadows. SHATTERS.
Oh, okay,
Disintegrates. Disintegrates.
I
okay.
would say diamond.
Diamonds. If you put a lump of coal, which, we tease about that at Christmas time, you've been bad, you're going to get a lump of coal. But if you put a lump of coal under extreme pressure, it ends up being a diamond. So that's the bit of hope that I offer at the beginning of this, is that we're talking about brains that have gone under a lot of stress while they were still developing before the children were age 18, but they also have resilience. So we're going to get to resilience in a few minutes. So the study that I was referring to, the study from 95 to 97, the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente began the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. They had over 17,000 participants, and they conducted this study and found out that, I don't know that they necessarily found that children weren't born as a blank slate, but it hasn't been that many years since we've discovered that children are not born as a blank slate. But they found that the children who had experienced the most adverse experiences were having very negative health outcomes in their later years, but were also having very negative behaviors and all while they were still in school. So we kind of tied the behaviors and the health outcomes And so the Surgeon General out in California a few years ago, I was watching a video that she did, and she was at the Bayview area of California, one of the poorest areas out in California. And she said that when she came across the ACEs study, she said she thought that this was the most earth-shattering finding that she had ever came across. And she said, you know, when we think about autism and ADHD, and, you know, she just started naming all of these childhood things. She said, when we start to think about that and the behavior problems that children have, she said, we can point back to this study and say, you know, this is what we've learned from the study. And so she really thought that this was going to sweep through just pediatric medicine in general. All these years later, so few people know about the outcomes of the ACEs study. So few people know what to do about the adverse experiences that children experience to begin with. And, you know, basically, I think what we've done about those adverse experiences for many, many, many years is we kind of hide those things at home and don't really talk about it. And as you'll see as we go throughout this, they do not stay hidden. So adverse childhood experiences, those traumatic things that are based on abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction before the age of 18 are linked to things like risky health behaviors, chronic health conditions, lower life expectancy, early death, or lower life potential. And so the number that you came up with a while ago when you went through and you answered those 10 questions determines your ACE score. So when I go through and I answer those 10 questions, I have an ACE score of about 6. I never asked my mother those questions, but she has an ACE score of about 7. So the difference is I had a more supportive family, even though I had those ACEs. I had a more supportive family in my mother and family that I grew up with than she had had, and in the severe poverty that she lived in as well. So when we think about what ACEs are, the abuse and neglect, that kind of makes sense more to us sometimes. I think we're talking about physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. We're talking about physical or emotional neglect. And then we're talking about household dysfunction, the mental health of the caregivers in the family, whether or not any of the adults in the family were incarcerated or had substance abuse problems, or whether the mother was treated violently and the children saw that. And I know it says mother there, and I know that we have a lot of different kinds of households now. And so I would just say, you know, for that household dysfunction, just seeing one of the adults in the family treated violently. And then divorce, being separated from your parents or a parent. So not just divorce, but also that would include not living with your biological parents, whether it's living with grandparents or whatever. So when you look at what the ACEs are, you look and see how they affect behaviors. So a lot of times, children who have a lot of household dysfunction kind of act as the parent in the household. And they might not get to play, which is the number one thing that children need to be doing, is playing. And they might not get to play and have the physical activity that they should. So therefore, maybe their muscles and bones and all don't develop and get as strong as other children that do get the chance to run and play. Other behaviors, smoking at a very young age, smoking because you live in a household where they smoke, Alcoholism, we know the effects of alcoholism. It's not just a choice, it's also hereditary. Drug use, and that would include legal and illegal drug use. And then missed work or missed school or missed commitments, however you want to say that. The physical and mental health. I referred to the cortisol a while ago. So it shouldn't surprise us that as children have more and more ACEs, we see more and more obesity, not just among children, but that obesity that develops across their lifetime. And with obesity, we see diabetes. Diabetes is one of those whole body systems that can affect a lot of different organs. Depression. If children grew up in a household where there were a lot of adverse experiences, not only do the children have a greater propensity toward depression, but they've learned from their parents or their caregivers how to experience depression. And so some of the things that we say about depression that have been said for many, many, many years, children hear that and think that that's what depression is, and that's how it should really affect you. Like laying in bed in a dark room all day long until, just before the kids come home from school or something. So, they learn through modeling. Suicide attempts, just the sheer stress alone. STDs, as we go through, that'll make more sense where the STDs kind of play in there. But many young people that have had a lot of adverse experience end up with more than 50 sexual partners. So, not hard to see where the STDs can come from. But broken bones, COPD, stroke. When I think about COPD, that was one that when I first saw it, I thought, oh, come on now, COPD. But if you think about it, a child that lives in a household like that, all the time, just taking that big, deep breath, scared. And as you breathe out of the top part of your lungs and your body becomes used to breathing out of the top part of your lungs, the bottom part of your lungs dies off. So we end up with children with asthma. Children with asthma tend to grow up to be adults with COPD unless some significant health changes are made. So what impact do ACEs have? As the number of ACEs increase, so do the possibilities of those negative health outcomes. In the study, they found that out of those 17,000 people in the area that, in the area where the study was conducted, was middle class. So when you start to think in terms of the results of the study, these are middle class. So we're not talking about just the poor individual or the poor families and their problems. We're talking that ACEs have no socioeconomic barriers. Now, your socioeconomic status can make a difference, but they're across all socioeconomic statuses. So they found out that 64% of the study had at least one ACE. 36% didn't have any. 26 had one. 16% had two. 10% had three, and 12% had 4 ACEs. We'll look at the health outcomes in a little bit with 4 or more ACEs. So I wanted to look at Kentucky. And so this information is a little newer than some of the others. But when we look at ACEs in Kentucky, The four most prevalent ACEs: divorce, an incarcerated relative, substance abuse, and economic hardship. 30% of Kentucky children will experience 2 or more ACEs before the age of 5, and those that experience 2 or more ACEs before the age of 5 do tend to go on and collect even more ACEs as they go throughout their teenage years. In May of 17, Kentucky was ranked as the 3rd highest death rate from drug overdose. Just saw an article this week where it's now been verified that a few years ago that we had so many opioids pumped into Kentucky that there was like 5 pills for every single individual in Kentucky at that time. So it shouldn't surprise us that we have the 3rd highest death rate from drug overdose. I'll say something else too while I'm talking about drug overdose and alcoholism. I don't like to judge on that because we're talking about adverse childhood experiences. The drug abuse, the alcohol use, they're self-medicating. It makes sense. They're doing the best they can with what they have. Again, one of the reasons that you all are involved with some of these families. Kentucky is the 12th highest for severe obesity, has a highest incidence of incarcerated relatives in the United States, and has a highest rate of child abuse in the United States. So that's where our children are coming from. When we look at poverty, poverty compounds everything. Poverty, as of 2016, 13% of the children will have experienced 3 or more adverse childhood experiences compared to those who don't live at the same poverty level that they live at. I came across something new to me. It's been out for a few years, but I don't know if you all have heard of this author or not. But Ruby Payne, and Ruby Payne talks about bridges out of poverty. And I found this so interesting the other day when I came across it. I'm going to add it to the presentation eventually, but it's just talking about the different ways that the people living in poverty versus those in middle class. It's talking about the different ways that we perceive things. One of the very first things that I found interesting is money. The middle class perceives money as something to be managed. People living in poverty perceive money as something to be spent. There's a big difference there. Another one, worldview. Last year when a lot of the riots and stuff started, I wondered why are the people there in St. Louis and, different places, why are they out on the interstate? The problem's not there. And I really struggled to understand that until I came across this. And that is people living in poverty, that their worldview is a local setting. So of course they're going to express their thoughts in their own local area. As to where middle class, and I guess that thought puts me over into middle class, is the middle class worldview is much broader than that and tends to be more of a national setting. So, so I'm thinking, why are they doing something, locally when this is a national issue? And so when you look at the mindset of people living in poverty, these things make perfect sense. Another one is the driving force of people that live in poverty. Again, in middle class, I think probably one of the worst things that could happen to me this week would be if I couldn't get to work. You know, if my car didn't start or something, I couldn't get to work. People who live in poverty, their driving force is their relationships. So, you know, at college, I shared this with my president and I told him, I said, here's the deal. I said, we're worried about students and we want them to care about their grade. And we don't understand why they'll spend days studying for a test. And we know they're prepared for the test because we've studied with them. And then grandma has a cough and boom, they're gone. Hour and a half from here to check on grandma instead of taking the test. And, you know, as a professor, a lot of people struggle with that. And when you look at it that way, you know, they want grandma to be proud of them and pass that test. But what's most important in their life is that relationship with grandma. They'll worry about the test later. So when we really think about the effect of poverty on adverse childhood experiences, it's very easy to see how poverty can compound many of the problems that people experience. So we'll also look at the United States poverty rate by ethnicity. The Native American is in the greatest poverty bracket. And then African American or Black, then Hispanic, and then white and Asian are pretty much at the same rate. So I broke these down into numbers for us because numbers make more sense to me than looking at pictures. But the Native American, and that is not American Indian, is not my terminology. That is from the CDC. But the national poverty rate is 25.4%. And then for Asian and white is 10.1. African American is 20.8 and Hispanic is 17.6. So, you know, we do have a real problem with poverty and the different ethnicities living in poverty. In addition to poverty, we'll think in terms of ACEs and the LGBTQ plus community. The LGBTQ plus community actually has the highest suicide rate of any population, even a higher suicide rate than the 85 and above population. From the Journal of Adolescence in 2015, there was a study that 51,000 participants participated in, and they were looking at the ACEs inventory, which is the questions you just took, but they probably also looked at health outcomes with it. And then they also looked at the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And they found that their participants self-identified into 3 different groups. They were either heterosexual, LGBTQ, or unsure. So, you know, unsure, we call that questioning. Kids need time to be okay with who they are, and they also need to be accepted. And I don't care which child we're talking about, acceptance is what we want. And I don't care what age child you are, acceptance is what you want. And so when we look at the LGBTQ plus population, and you look at the lack of acceptance over so many years, and the things that we've done to this population, I teach Psychology 110 at Bluegrass. And when we start talking about some of the mental health surgeries and some of the mental health things that we've done over the years, many of those were done at Eastern State Hospital. And I teach on the Newtown campus, which is located on the old Eastern State Hospital. And so I'll tell students about conversion therapy. They did conversion therapy right there at Eastern State Hospital And most of the conversion therapy was among men, simply because that's society's issue with gay men. And so they would hook the genitals of the men up to electrodes, and then they would show them videos, and they would show them a heterosexual video, but they wouldn't shock them with any painful shocks. And then they would show homosexual video or with homosexual content, and they would shock the genitals of the men, and they thought that would change them, so that when they had homosexual thoughts, that they would feel that pain and not be that way. And one of my students asked me one day, did it work? And I said, I'm sure it did. I mean, if I was a guy and they did that to me, it would just take one time till I would say I'm cured. But, you know, did it work? No, it didn't work. Of course it didn't work. You know, so when we think about the discrimination and all that's gone along with this population, we shouldn't have any shock at all when we say that their suicidal ideation alone is 3 times higher, the attempts is 4 times higher than the average population. Sometimes it's early on, they're unsure of their own sexuality, then they're unsure of the acceptance. So, and some of these different groups really struggle with adverse childhood experiences in ways that we might not think about sometimes. Lifetime suicide attempts for highly rejected LGBTQ young people. My goodness. You know, the more they're rejected, the more attempts. So the correlation between suicidal ideation and family rejection for the LGBTQ plus population is much higher than for any other population. I think this is one of the last slides. In the study that had the 55,000 people in it, so they kind of compared the ACE scores between the lesbian, gay, or bisexual individuals compared to the heterosexual individuals. And they found out that even though the heterosexual individuals had 38 of them had 1 ACE, compared to only 25% of the LGBTQ ACEs. And so you kind of look through 2 ACEs, again, lower, 3 ACEs, kind of starts to turn and get higher. But just, you know, in those different populations, I just find it interesting to look at the different things that have compounded these adverse childhood experiences and have gone on into adult life with some of the people in that study. So one of the things that the CDC Kaiser Permanente study came up with was the impact on future violence for victimization and perpetration. And so, you know, when you look at adverse childhood experiences from conception to death, we start with this generational embodiment historical trauma. Think in terms of phrases that you've heard maybe your mother or father say that have to do with family secrets. Family secrets goes down in that category. Every family has secrets. You know, social conditions, adverse experiences. We get into the disrupted neurodevelopment, and children they're under that kind of pressure. Their brains do not develop and their neurons do not fire like a normal brain. So they end up with learning disabilities. They end up with emotional problems, social, emotional, cognitive impairment. And, you know, one of the things that children are learning that first 18 years of their life is social and emotional regulation. They're learning the golden rule, which I think sometimes has almost gone out the window, but they're learning how they want to be treated. They're learning how to treat others. And, you know, when you put children who are not accepted because they might not have clean clothes to wear, or they might not smell so good, or, you know, sometimes they might have two mommies or two daddies or something of that nature, then you can see how their social emotional brain wiring does not happen correctly because of all the stress that goes along with what they experience. So they often adopt risky behaviors, risky health behaviors. Children see their parents, their guardians, their cousins smoking cigarettes, and you know, they may say, this helps to calm me down, and the child's like, golly, I've had a rough life, I need to calm down too. So they start to mimic those habits. They learn that, you know, the reason that dad drinks is because he's stressed. Children learn, oh, when I get stressed, then to relieve that, I would drink. And so, you know, kind of leads into disease, disability, social problems, and then eventually the possibility of early death. So before we go into some of the different health outcomes, I do want to kind of stop and say that just because you have ACEs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even 10, just because you have ACEs does not mean that you're necessarily going to experience poor health outcomes or a difference in life expectancy. Children's positive experiences and protective factors help to guard against some of the negative health outcomes. So, you know, resilience, and we start to look at different things in our life that has helped us to be resilient. One of the things I think of is I have a brother who's 13 years older than me. And because my mother suffered significantly with major depressive disorder her whole life, he pretty much took care of me for the first 5 years of my life when he was in the Navy. Well, that built a lot of resilience in me. Even when, you know, my mother was depressed, I still had my brother to depend on. So children do have different people who step in and provide that resilience. As a matter of fact, that's what you all do, is you step in and you help these children become more resilient. And I've heard the stories. I've talked to many CASA volunteers, and the reason you do this is your passion, is you want these children to succeed. You want them to have somebody that they can depend on. And so you are a big part of their life story, and you're a big part of the thread in their life that they're going to look back on one day and say, I'm here today because of, and then they'll say your name, because that's what CASA does, is support children. They're the voice for children. And you, if you didn't care, you wouldn't be doing this. So when we talk about protective factors, CASA is one of the biggest protective factors that I know of. As a matter of fact, how I even heard about CASA was I was looking for what protective factors do children have. And I came across CASA and started to really look into it, found out that a friend of mine has been in CASA for several years, and just absolutely fell in love with the mission. So actually, before we start some of the health outcomes, I'm just going to pause for a second because I've been talking for like 45 minutes. And I just want to give you all a chance to, I don't know, breathe for a minute, talk if you want to, run to the restroom real quick so you don't miss nothing, whatever you need to do. So unmute if you want to, and let's kind of talk for a second, and then we'll move on.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi.
Sorry, I have my camera off. Maybe I can start that. There we go. Hi, I'm Jen, and my kiddos go to the STEAM Academy, which is kind of a BCTC partner. And I was just curious if you have ever taught any classes to the high schoolers, because I can see so much of this being really useful for them, kind of understanding their family of origin situation and maybe why they feel the way they feel, or kind of have experienced some of the things they've experienced. So I was just kind of curious if you've ever done that.
I am not part of the STEAM Academy. I do know the STEAM Academy does take Psychology 110. I do
Okay.
teach that class. And in my class, I do talk about adverse childhood experiences. And I because to me, I just don't see, now that I know about it, I don't see how I can teach psychology and even developmental psychology without talking about it.
Sure. Yeah. This has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anybody else have anything? All right.
I just had a quick question when you talked about the different ACEs for children of different ages. What about if a child, is this just based on the environmental side of things? So say like you have a child in foster care that's removed at 1 year old, is that going to reduce the ACEs because they're going to be maybe raised in a different family? Because you had spoke about, some children, we know that we're not born blank. So we have different genetics that maybe trace back to, our biological families and that sort of thing. So is that just based on environmental for the kids?
It is based on both nature and nurture. And of course, with adoption, that removes the child from that situation. But adoption itself can also bring even more problems. If the child is adopted out to a good, loving family, and has what that child needs, it's absolutely going to reduce their ACEs. If the child stays in foster care and gets bounced back and forth, that's going to compound their ACEs. So as I went through the CASA volunteer training, that's one of the things I thought about a lot was in those scenarios that we have to work through, every time I would think, should this child be removed from the home? My next thought was, if we do, that's one more ACE. So, there's a lot more to it than just taking that child out and making them safe. So, but yes, I think probably most every training I do, I'll have that question about adoption. And that is no different than, if you think about this, I don't know, I hope I don't insult anybody when I say this, but a puppy that's never had any training and, just a wild little puppy running around, and you bring that puppy into the home and you start feeding it and taking care of it and loving on it, it's the best dog you're ever going to have. Children are the same way. You take a child that is not getting their needs met and you adopt that child out to a loving family, they're going to thrive. Their ACE score is going to plummet, hopefully. So, all right, any other comments, and we'll move on.
Jenny, just one quick thing. That ACEs questionnaire you shared at the beginning, is it possible for you to send that to me after this, and I'll send it out to everyone who attends?
I'll be glad to, yes.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, the questions are all over the internet, but you kind of have to copy paste. So I just created my own.
Hey,
All right.
this is Kirsten, a volunteer manager, and Jen Cathy's question about teaching this to high school students. There is a great documentary that's available on Amazon Prime called Paper Tigers, which is a high school, I can't remember what state it's in, but it is a school that really focuses on ACEs and teaching their kids the signs and how to overcome things. So that might be something that everybody might want to check out. So
Thank you for that. Paper Tigers is great. Yes. And we're going to be, I'm actually leading a study at BCTC. We're getting ready to do an ACEs study. We're gearing up for it for next year, starting in the fall. All right. Maybe if I go back here, I'll be where I was. No, it's okay. I can get us there. All right. All right. So we'll look at some of these different health outcomes, and I know that you're going to have questions at the end of this because people normally do. So again, when you see this, I want you to think about two things. I want you to think about not just your ACE score and how close you are to, let's say, either the 4 or the 1, but also want you to think about where you are now in life, right? Where you are now, emotionally, physically, health-wise, because I want you to continue to think about your own resilience, and we'll be to resilience in a few minutes. People who have 4 or more ACEs are 7 times more likely than the average population to consider themselves an alcoholic. It's important that they consider themselves an alcoholic. That doesn't include the people who don't consider themselves an alcoholic, but yet still drink. They're 4.7 more times likely to use illicit drugs. So you can see some of the hepatitis and, even things like that come with illicit drug use, not to mention the effect of the drug itself. Now you want to talk about self-medicating. Here we are. 10.3 times more likely than someone in the average population to have injected drugs. That blows my mind, not because I'm thinking, oh my God, those people are awful, but I'm thinking, oh my goodness, look at the psychological pain that they're in. The alcohol, the illicit drug use, the injected drug use. And then we get to 50 or more intercourse partners. They're trying to self-medicate. They're looking for someone who cares about them. We can't judge that, people. We can't judge that. They're just trying to be okay with life and find someone who cares. Shouldn't be surprised that the STD goes right along with the partners. Smoking cigarettes. And then I saw that one, and this line right here, suicide attempt 12.2, is what finally caught my attention when I was looking for the answer to why do people die by suicide. And I kind of stop and I look at this sign and I say, look, they try to medicate. They try to find somebody that cares about them. And when they don't, they end up in this bottom category with a suicide attempt or suicide ideation. And, I don't know about your family, but it seems like in my family, they tried to keep the suicides quiet. That was the family secret. I blew the lid off that stuff. I finally went to my brothers after my mother died, and I said, I know Mom would want us to be good brothers and sisters here and keep this quiet for her. But I said, you know what? Keeping quiet, our people are still dying. So we opened it up. We got my nephews and my nieces together and we sat down, we talked about it. And we told them, this is a normal part of our family. This is hereditary. Let's quit hiding it. Let's support one another instead. Rather than having everybody feel so alone, let's support each other. So again, things we can do to decrease some of these possibilities. COPD, we talked about that one a while ago. 4 or more ACEs, the odds ratio is 2.5 times more likely than the average population. So ischemic heart disease, cancer, hepatitis, depression, stroke, bronchitis or emphysema, diabetes, severe obesity. I usually, I was usually give this in person. And about a year or so ago, I was giving this presentation and I got to this slide. And so, you know, we always have people who don't really buy into this very quickly. They kind of step back, and this slide always prompts some of those raised eyebrows because they go, look, isn't this kind of the leading cause of the deaths in the United States? How can we say this is all due to adverse childhood experiences? Well, one of the ways that we can do that is we can take people with the lower ACE scores that have died, and we can look at how they died, and people with higher ACE scores, and look at, you know, their health outcomes. And that's kind of what this study does, is they look at how many ACEs you had in childhood and then what your health problems are later in life. And they draw a correlation between those two. It's not a one-for-one correlation. But when you see the severe obesity and the diabetes, I go back to childhood sexual abuse and the stress hormone and the cortisol. I don't know if you all have ever heard this before, but for years, I used to hear that, well, when little girls are sexually abused, they eat a lot, so they won't be as attractive to another abuser. And I used to hear that, and I used to think, hogwash, that is crazy. That doesn't even sound logical to me, but I'd heard that my whole life. No, actually what happens is when these children are abused, their brain starts pumping out all this cortisol. It's not intentional. So again, when you look at severe obesity, before we judge, we need to stop and say, wow, that person could have really been through a lot in their life. Before we judge, we have to kind of stop and go, number one, I'm glad you're still alive and still with us. You know, kind of that your shoes might not match, but you're here. So, and then this one, I'll tell you a real quick story about this slide. So when 23 years ago, when my mom died, I was in my late 30s. And I just didn't understand it. I never will. I mean, you know, I'm her daughter, so I can explain your person to you, but nobody can explain it to me. So, but I was talking to her friend, one of her best friends, and really, her best friend grew up in a lower socioeconomic status, but basically had a loving home. My mother grew up in poverty and had no love, and hardly any love in her home. And then they both married someone and kind of grew into that middle class. And so she was mom's best friend, and she died a little over a year ago. She was 96 years old when she died. And so I asked her back then, I said, you know, I don't know when it's going to be okay for me to be okay with my mom being gone. Like, when would she have died a natural death? Will I be okay when that day comes? Like, and so my friend, my mom's best friend, said to me, you know, I think when I'm gone, it'll be okay for her to be gone. I said, okay. Well, that was 20 some years ago. And May of last year, in June of last year, I was given this presentation. And when I kind of stopped to prepare for it, I came up on this slide, and that's when it hit me. She said that it would be okay for my mom to be gone when she was gone. And there was exactly a 20-year difference between those two. And that is when that 20-year difference in life expectancy came to life for me. So that is a little bit about the health outcomes. So the next thing I kind of want to get into, and I know this is hard for you all to see, and I really do need to cut it down because I'm really only going to focus on that first column anyhow, but the dysfunctional family roles. So I want to ask you who your child is, and whether this is your the child that you have with your through CASA, or if this is maybe just a child that you work with, or a child that you may go to church with. But you start to pick out some of these children. So when coming from dysfunctional families, you might see a child that is playing the role of a hero. They are perfect. They can't be wrong. They get positive attention. They're always getting awards and degrees. But what you don't see is their intense fear of failure. You don't see how their brain tries to control everything, because the hero is a hero to make the family feel better. The hero is a hero for a family, but they do it so often, it spills over into their social emotional regulation, which is their life with their friends and family and cousins and all. Or the scapegoat. You know, the scapegoat tends to be bad, angry, impulsive, not good enough. But have you ever heard anybody describe themselves as, I'm the scapegoat of the family? I'm the problem. I'm the one that gets blamed for everything. That's what they feel. They feel that hurt. They feel the rejection. They feel the shame. So you're scapegoat. And, you know, when you think about kids in school, you can go into a classroom and pick these kids out. And they'll always say, just blame it on me. I don't care. Everybody blames everything on me. That's your scapegoat. A lost child. Sometimes we might think these children are just quiet or timid or shy. And some children are, and that's okay. But when we have a child that's been through a lot of adverse experiences, they feel invisible, and they get to where they really can't express their feelings. Then we have the clown or the mascot. And, you know, even think back to your high school days, and you remember these kids in your classes. And so that the clown, the one that was always funny, no matter what happened, they made everybody laugh. And now, you know, they may have been hiding a whole lot of pain. They may have been hiding a whole lot of scars. So, you know, when you think about coming into contact with children, and you see children playing out these different roles, you know, ask yourself why. Why are they playing out these different roles? There's more to it than what we see. There's more to it than what we think. You know, don't read something that's not there, but be cognizant of what is. So the CDC offers these kind of guidelines to prevent ACEs, or to guard against ACEs. And so strengthening economic family supports, and we see a lot of that, community action and different places that help with children, childcare. In the last year, we've seen dinner, food, diapers, all kinds of things that households need given to them. We need to change the social norms to support parents. In other words, rather than parents getting in trouble for the way they treat their children, why can't we have supports to teach those parents how to treat their children? I don't think parents abuse children because of a lack of love. They don't. The parents are the first to tell you how much they love that child, and that's true, and that's real love. The only problem is they've never been taught how to parent. None of us were. Some of us got by. Some of us aren't. So, you know, I would much rather than have social services go into a home and remove a child, I'd rather see social services go into the home and support the family. I look forward to a day that we're there. provide quality care and education in life. We've seen those programs. We have those programs for early childhood education. And here, enhance parenting skills. We don't have enough of that. And then intervene to lessen harms and prevent future risk. Again, that's where CASA is. So we start to look at resilience. So what is resilience? Resilience, that ability to bounce back, recover, be okay, however you want to say it. But stress, we've talked about unavoidable stress. We've talked about unavoidable trauma. But we can avoid resilience. We can say, no, we can't go forward. We stick our head in the sand and we kind of stop there and kind of become stagnant. Or we can think about what happened to us in our life and how we got to where we are. So when we first started talking about an ACEs study at the college president said, so why don't faculty really understand where students are? Faculty have been where students are. Why don't they get it? And I said, we forgot. We have lived through, we have become resilient. We've gotten on the other side of the poverty that we felt when we were college students, which may or may not have been real poverty. But we forget. And so to me, these ACEs trainings for college faculty help those faculty to remember where they came from too, what they went through. And just because they've rationalized everything in their mind now, they forget that sometimes that's where our students or that's where our children still are. So when we look at building resilience, we look at realize, recognize, respond, and resist. So what we want to resist is re-traumatization. But to realize the widespread impact of stress and trauma, in other words, widespread impact, this is not abnormal. I'm sorry to say that. This is widespread. If we just accept that this is going on in different homes, then we can start to talk about it. Then we can start to open it up. But as long as society allows it to stay quiet, then we won't see a difference. Recognize the signs and symptoms of stress and trauma in ourselves and in the community. You know, when you start to look at this past year, do you see the signs and symptoms of stress in our community? I do. We've had more drug overdoses in Kentucky in the past year. It has grown astronomically compared to previous years. Not just, you know, the pandemic, the uncertainty, but, you know, we can talk about the drug use, but I'm going to go talk about the resilience. And I won't ask for a show of hands, but, you know, I can remember back last spring and summer, I could not wait until 4 o'clock in the afternoon because Uncle Andy came on at 4 o'clock and he gave me hope. He gave me hope that we were going to get through the pandemic and that we were all going to get through it together. And every day at 4 o'clock, he came on and he gave Kentuckians hope. And so that's the same thing that we do in CASA with our children. They grow up in a family where they might not have the love and the hope and someone who cares about them. And then you come alongside them and you realize the impact of ACEs and you recognize their stress, and what you want to do is you want to make it all go away. And how do you do that? By spending time with them, by investing time in them and just being there for them. So when I look at the R's of building resilience, I'm like, okay, CASA realizes this, CASA recognizes this, and CASA responds to this. And so to respond to the need for resilience, your personal behaviors, policies, procedures, legislation, practices, building resilience, caring about people, and then just resisting that re-traumatization. So we kind of look through this resilience pyramid and we see what we can practice to build resilience. And, you know, in you, but also what you can talk to your children about to help them build resilience and to help them practice resilience. And that is, number one, to breathe. One of the first things the very first thing that I do in my classroom is when I walk into my classroom, I greet my students, and then I look at them and I say, everybody, deep breath, breathe, and just breathe. And breathe. If you allow someone to take a deep breath in your presence, you're asking them to be in your presence, in your spirit with their spirit. It's a connection to breathe. Teach them to eat well and to exercise and to get out and move, to get a good night's sleep. Some of these children, the only time they get to sleep is in school. They spend half their night scared or, you know, with different things going on in their family. I talked to a young man just a few weeks ago that he's 17 years old. And he said he was in all kinds of trouble. He keeps falling asleep in school. And then he started telling me why he was awake at night. And he's just not in a safe place. And he's just not getting the sleep that he needs. His grades are suffering. His health is suffering. His job is suffering. At 17 years old, he's worried about his job suffering. So, you know, tell them what to practice to build resilience: breathing, eating, moving, sleeping, and then have fun. Have fun. I mean, engage in something that restores you. Have fun, get with other people, do something that brings you pleasure. Get out in nature. Put your feet in the dirt and connect with the earth. Another thing that you can teach them to do is to reflect. Reflect on what they know, what they've learned. Reflect on a growth mindset. These things have happened, but who do you want to be? What are you going to change when you have your own home, when you have your own children, when you get to make the decisions? And think of that growth mindset and use the growth mindset to teach them that life doesn't have to be the way that they grew up. Life can change at any time for the better. They already know it can change for the worse. And then teach them to practice mindfulness, being present. Being present. One of the things that I like to teach on being present is just waiting until it's your turn to talk and listening until it's your turn to talk. You know, be present where you are. And then teach them to make meaning, express gratitude, show their strengths. I know one of the things that we heard back in December was that many children weren't going to get to visit with their family because of COVID. And, you know, that to me was very sad. And so my hope was that whoever they were with would help them make meaning for this last holiday season during this pandemic, and then teach them to be their self, but to be their best self. So we'll come to a point here where I just asked this question: whose life will you impact in a positive way that will reduce their negative, current, and long-term health outcomes? So you think about that. You come in contact with people every day. Every day you are the smile that they might not otherwise see. You're the caring person that looks back at them in the eyes when they look at you. Think about some of the children rarely ever have anybody that'll look them in the eye and make that intimate contact with them in a social, personal way. So whose life will you impact? So I asked for 2 hours. I thought an hour and a half would be about right. But I wanted to save time for discussion because I know that you all have thoughts and things that you want to talk about. So let's open it up for discussion. Anybody have a comment or a question? Here's in chat. I can see chat now. Oh, those are old. Okay.
I think you were very good, and I know I will be able to use a lot of what you said, both for myself and for the CASA kiddos. I've always had much younger children, but I'm going to tackle a teenager soon, I know.
I think they're going to be fun too, though, the teenagers.
Well, it's a challenge, I'm sure.
Thank you so much. This was so great. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you could send the dysfunctional family roles piece as well, because I think that would be really helpful to have as a resource. But thank you so much too for this pyramid. It's very hopeful to be able to think of things to do for the kids and say to them. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. This question, is it appropriate for younger kids to know and understand ACEs? I think it's appropriate to the level that they can understand it. What I mean by that is we don't have to tell children that things are happening to them that shouldn't be happening to them. They already know that. I think the biggest part that I would want a young child to understand is that their life is not always going to be this way. And I think things can get better, or giving them hope. I think that's kind of the level that really young children could understand, is helping them to instill hope in themselves.
I had a question about, you had spoke about if there's parents that have a lot of ACEs and there's children in those situations where that have been removed. What do you think is the solution as far as those needs for those parents? I know like right now we're seeing a lot, especially with COVID, that there's just not a lot of options for parenting classes, or there's not a lot of services to, even if you had a parent that was super willing to want to learn to be better and do better, that seems like one huge gap. But also because of that gap, it does seem like sometimes reunification is not always best because those resources aren't there. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, it's every case is going to be so individual. I mean, and even for brothers and sisters, they might have the same experience, but they don't experience it the same way. So you can end up with 2 children living in a household, the exact same thing happening to them, but just their personal differences, they experience it differently.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think about with that is when someone in the family dies, and everybody in the family experiences a different loss, though it's the same person who they lost. So, you know, one lost a mother, another one lost a wife, another one may have lost a friend. So, you know, it's the same death experienced different ways, the same childhood experienced different ways.
Do you see that being the biggest gap, is those services that parents are needing as far as kind of relearning the way they were raised and to do
do.
different? Is that the biggest gap that you see?
I do. The biggest gap that I see is the lack of parenting education,
Mm-hmm.
and then the judgment that we put on parents when they don't know.
Hmm.
Because even, I mean, and I don't know, I might be naive, but my thought is parents really don't want to hurt their children.
Mm-hmm.
They just don't know any other way to express their anger
Mm-hmm.
or their emotion or their frustration, or it's rarely about the child. It's rarely about the child.
Right.
So I think children can understand to the extent that hopefully we can help them to understand that it doesn't always have to be that way. But at the same time, they're there.
Yeah.
So, you know, we give them hope where they are.
Mm-hmm.
But parenting education, and then, you know, if we're going to judge parents for being bad parents, then I think we need to make sure that the resources are in place. And we just don't have those at the federal level
Mm-hmm.
and state level.
Thank you.
Mhm. But that's just my thoughts. I mean, the governor might come along and say something different. Any other questions or comments?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You were addressing the student you met with, and then he opened up to you about his lack of sleep and what was going on in his household.
Mhm.
So how do you respond to somebody, you know, that then has come to you? Then how are you able to help them?
Well, the only reason that they're going to come to me is because it's affecting them at school. So, you know, they'll come with, and where I'm an assistant dean, I'm the go-between between the faculty and the student. So when a student is not getting along with a faculty member or vice versa, I help to solve that situation. And so what I try to help solve that situation with is compassion. That's the only tool that I have in my toolbox that fits everybody. And so with that compassion, I try to teach the instructors things like, yes, I know that you sent an announcement out 10 times to this student about that quiz that really isn't all that important anyway, but that quiz is the most important thing to this student. If you're telling me it's no big deal, they can just miss the test, I'm telling you, it's everything in their world right now. Let them make it up if it's no big deal. Now, I don't know about your all's professors, but I don't think I ever had a professor that had anybody talk to them that way. And my own faculty will tell you they've never had an assistant dean that talked to them that way. But doing it from that compassionate standpoint, you know, I'll often say to faculty, you mean to tell me that because they missed one test, they have to retake and repay for an entire semester? Why can't we let them make up a test? Where in your heart is it so hardened that you can't find compassion for that student? And then they'll say, well, their grandmother died last week. I'm like, okay, and they might have yet 5 more grandmothers to die next week, but we're dealing with this grandmother this week. So, you know, I think just bringing people back to what the problem is, and that's where we get into the more discriminatory kinds of things, is when we start saying you should have, you could have, but you didn't. The book I referred to a while ago, Ruby Payne and the Bridges Out of Poverty, one of the things that she says is she said she was a high school counselor, and she said there was 2 sisters that came to school, and it was Christmas time, and since the first day of school, they had worn they had 2 outfits, and they had worn those outfits every other day. And from some weeks to the next, those outfits didn't even get washed. And so they wore those clothes every other day. And she said that she was in the counseling office, and she said that, you know, it was just a student came in, a teacher came in talking about a student, and was talking about how they didn't have clothes. And she said just something in her heart. And she said, here, there's $200. Give this to the mother and have her buy clothes. And so knowing that that family lived in poverty, Ruby Payne did not expect that child to get clothes. And so after Christmas, she said, there's the child, both children still wearing those same clothes. And so she went up to him and she said, did you have a good Christmas? And she said, yeah, my mommy got us a DVD player. We've never had a DVD player before. We can watch TV at home. And Ruby Payne said, good for you. She said, I'm glad you got that. She said, I knew those kids weren't going to get clothes, but she said, I thought if the family was that poor, they would find something to spend that money on. Again, you know, she said, our middle class mindset, they should have bought clothes. The poverty mindset, we can have fun for just a few minutes. So.
Jenny, do you think that the experience that our school children have had this last year is going to qualify as a counter for an ACE all by itself?
You know, it has to. I mean, I don't know if we're going to have an 11th category or what, but this has been crazy. I mean, you know, last spring I can remember people worried about whether or not their seniors were going to get to go to the prom. And I know that was a big concern, seriously. But gosh, look how much these kids have missed in the last year. They've missed building relationships. They've missed playtime. They've missed life experiences. They've missed time with family. They've missed time in school. They've missed time on the playground. They've missed time to just sit and be a child. So I don't see how we're going to come to the end of this without probably more mental health problems than we've had before. I am hoping, I served on the governor's task force to reopen child care centers. I'm wanting to reach out now and see if we're going to have something for the school age children to kind of reconnect. I don't know if there's any plans of that or not. I haven't heard, but our kids, they need each other. And when they are in school, one thing I like about the teachers, when they are in school, they let them play and socialize, and that's what they need. The number one job of a child is to play. That's their job. It's their life's work as long as they're a child. And they're not getting to do that. Anybody else?
I was also worried about the kids because they didn't attend school for so long. Some of the cases that we see as CASA advocates did not come to anybody's attention, because a lot of times it is teachers or bus drivers or school administration that has a hint of that something is not right in that child's life. And this is now a full year that these children did not have that backup plan, that security net, looking out for them and checking, is there food in the house? You know, do they need resources? And if there was a bruise, is it from falling off the playground equipment, or is it from something worse?
Yeah, that was really evident last spring when they were sending bags of food home with children because school was out. That was very evident. The lack of food in the home, and that was sad, but very evident. And yes, these children they need to get out and be able to socialize. And, you know, every time I hear about our teachers not wanting to go back to school, it makes me so angry, because just like you said, our teachers are the ones that really keep tabs on these children and know more about their home life than anybody else. And our teachers want to be back in school. They want to do it safely, but they want to be back with their children. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. All right, anybody else?
I think there was a question in the comments in the chat.
Have you any insight to role or the faith community can have? I think the not a lot of insight other than, you know, the faith community does play a role in caring for children. I know that just from being part of the faith community myself. The people who teach Sunday school and children's church and, you know, all of those things. But again, in our faith community, not much attendance over the last year, not allowed to have much attendance over the last year. And then when it has been allowed, there's been so much sickness, we haven't had a lot of attendance. But I think the faith community has that same supportive role to come alongside children in their journey and help them along the way. I don't have anything specific there, but that's in the faith community, that's what we're supposed to be doing. One of the things that I will say about the faith community though, and maybe it's just my own background, but I think we could lose some judgment in the faith community. You know, children might not smell good or they might not be clean, but they always need a hug, or they at least need to know you care. It's a pat on the head or whatever. They at least need to know you care. And in the faith community, I've often wondered why we invite everybody to attend, but then once they get there, we kind of look at them like, why are they here? I mean, you know, if you really stop and think about that, we might not mean to, but, or then someone will come in, you know, when I grew up in Lexington, and I can remember when families would come into our church and we would try to help meet their needs and give them some money and some clothes and some food. But then, you know, even though I was just a teenager, I could hear some of the talk like, well, you know what, they're just going to take that money, they're going to blow it, they're going to do this, they're going to do that. But you know what, in thinking about that poverty mindset, you blow money too. I mean, you know, it just because they got some money, they got to blow. How do you call it blowing money when that's the only entertainment they might have this month? You know, and everybody wants experiences with their children. So, but I know that just from personal experience, I look back now and I think, wow, we helped people, but I think we were a little bit too judgmental when we helped them too. Not everybody, but you know, you see it. So, it's just my thoughts on the faith community. Anything else? Well, I know y'all have had a long day, and do not tell my students I let you out early because they would be insanely jealous. I am not a let out early kind of person. I'm usually like, okay, I know we ended a minute ago, but I got one more thing to say. But feel free to reach out if you want to talk more, or we do have other people at the college that are well-versed in ACEs. If you have other avenues that you would like for any of us to come speak at, let me know. I've been working with a group of faculty now for a little over a year in training to start the ACEs study at Bluegrass. So we have several people that could come speak to any of your groups or even faith groups. So just let me know.
Thank you so much, Jenny. This was a fantastic continuing education.
Thank
Thanks
you.
everyone who attended and for all your participation, your good questions. Once we wrap up here, I'll send out an email momentarily with a link to fill out a survey about this training. That helps us let us know how we're doing and what other trainings you might like to see us offer. Our next continuing education will also be on Zoom on April 20th from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. and the topic is using your therapeutic communication toolbox. In May, we'll be offering our Fostering Futures training again for CASA volunteers who want to provide good support for older teens as they transition into adulthood. And if you'd like to attend either of those trainings, you can visit casaoflexington.org/continuing-education or email me at info@casaoflexington.org for more information. And I think that wraps us up. Thanks to everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.